Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. You're attending the Implementation Translational Science RIG webinar titled Navigating the Field of Implementation Science Toward Maturity. I'm Janet Baker. I'm the co-chair of the Translational Science RIG, and I'm here with Molly McNett, who's also a co-chair. Molly will be the moderator for our program today, and Molly has a few things to tell you about the program today and what we'd like you to do.
Great, thank you and welcome everyone. We're so happy to have you here. Janet will be introducing our speakers, and as they go through the talk, there will be certain kind of pause points for questions and discussion points of clarification that will be posed by our speakers. We encourage your participation at those kind of set time points, and you're welcome to either put comments or questions in the chat, and I'm happy to moderate those and read those as we go along. And then certainly at the kind of pause points for discussion, we encourage you to raise your hand if you'd like to participate in the discussion, and I will kind of call on people in the order that your hand is raised to help facilitate that conversation going forward. But this is really meant to be an active and engaged session with all of you that includes dialogue based on your perspective. So we're happy to help facilitate that as we go through. Janet, back to you.
Sure. So I have the distinguished privilege of introducing these two phenomenal speakers today who have so much expertise in this area. Dr. Karen Emmons is a professor of social and behavioral science at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She has experience in cancer equity and in implementation science. Her work focuses on community-engaged approaches to implementation of cancer prevention and early detection interventions in settings that serve historically disadvantaged communities. She has more than 300 peer-reviewed publications and has served as a PI for multiple NIH-funded research projects and centers. She has also served as faculty director of the Community Engagement Program for Harvard's Clinical Translational Science Award, Harvard Catalyst, which focuses on advancing evidence-based strategies to improve community health and creating bidirectional relationships between community partners and researchers. She serves as the MPI of the Harvard Chan's T32 training grant in cancer prevention and control and has received multiple mentoring awards. Her research has also been recognized by honors including the Morse Distinguished Research Award, Outstanding Senior Cancer Scientist Award from the Society of Behavioral Medicine, and Outstanding Scientist Award from the Society of Behavioral Medicine. She is a past president of the Society of Behavioral Medicine, a member of the National Academy of Medicine, and a member of the National Cancer Advisory Board, and a member of the Community Preventative Service Task Force. Then we also have Dr. David Chambers. He's the Deputy Director for Implementation Science in the Office of the Director of the Division of Cancer Control and Population Science at the National Cancer Institute. Dr. Chambers manages a team focusing on efforts to build and advance the field of implementation science through funding, opportunities, training programs, research activities, dissemination platforms, and enhancement of partnerships and network to integrate research practice and policy. Prior to his arrival at NIH, Dr. Chambers worked as a member of a research team at Oxford University, where he studied national efforts to implement evidence-based practice within healthcare systems. He publishes on strategic directions in implementation science and serves as a plenary speaker at numerous scientific conferences. He received an AB degree with honors in economics from Brown University, an MSc and DPHI degree in management studies in organizational behavior from Oxford University. Welcome, Dr. Chambers, Dr. Emmons.
Thanks so much for having us. It's good to see familiar faces. It's always, and names, it's also good to see new folks who I look forward to learning from. What was not mentioned in Karen's distinguished bio was the several years that we were fortunate enough to have her working directly with our implementation science team at the NCI. And so it has always been such a privilege to be able to learn from Karen and to walk down this particular road of really reflecting on the years that we've spent trying to work with many of you and others to grow the science. And so it is a privilege to be with you all today. It's a privilege to be with Karen, sharing this discussion. And so what I'm going to do is just share my screen, and then so hopefully you will now see just by nods you see the slide that should be up there. Okay. So what we want to do is have as much discussion as possible, really. The invited commentary that we're talking about today came out of a desire to really reflect on what are some of the assumptions that we have made, what are some of the areas of progress that we have made in the field, but also what are some of the challenges that we've seen. And you're right in the heart of it, of trying to make sure that we are as rigorous as possible in the science that we do, but it has as much relevance to the communities, to these systems, to practitioners, to patients, to families, to systems as it possibly can. And so what we want to do through the course of this discussion is just talk through some of the observations we've made, and then talk with you about what resonates. What do you think are some steps that we can take so that we avoid creating yet another silo or a gap between the questions that we're asking and the benefit that we hope that answering those questions can come from. So that's what we're going to do, just to set a little bit more context. Many of us have family right now who are in the midst of this terrible situation in California. So we're wishing our best to our loved ones and yours and friends who are affected by this. This is also the day that we as a federal government are closed honoring the legacy of President Carter. I never had a chance to meet him directly. I did have a chance to meet his wife when I gave a talk at the Carter Center, and what an incredible legacy they leave behind. So just to set a little bit more context, since we know from implementation science, context really matters. So I'm going to turn things over to Karen, who's going to walk through just some level setting, I think, Karen, right? As far as what do we mean by implementation science? And I'll navigate slides while you get to hear from her wisdom.
Great. Thanks so much, David. And David's exactly right that we have had so much fun working together, both in terms of thinking about specific implementation science questions, but more importantly, the field and the broader issues facing the field and how we think about those. So, as a scientist, I'm guessing that many on this call, you're kind of head down, and it's a real privilege and a joy to have the opportunity to kind of look up and say, oh, what are the bigger field issues? So we're going to give you a little of both in this brief presentation. So starting off with what is implementation science, just want to level set and make sure everybody is on sort of the same page with at least the basics. So if you go to the next slide. In a nutshell, this slide really captures it. The latest research shows that we really should do something with all that research, advance. And then you have, this idea of if you build it, will they come? And in implementation science, before that field really started, the answer was, well, not so much. We had lots and lots of scientific evidence that just was not getting put into practice. And I would say generally we're better, but we still have a long way to go. We still have lots of things that we know that we don't do for everyone in every setting. So that's really what implementation science is about, is how we move science into practice in a sustainable way, in an equitable way, so that it impacts and improves care for everybody. Next slide. So the formal definition of implementation science is the study of the scientific study of methods to promote the systematic uptake of research findings and other evidence-based practices into routine practice to improve the quality and effectiveness of healthcare services and care. Another definition is what my students refer to as the world according to Karen, which is making what we know, what we do for everyone in every setting. And that's how I think about implementation science is, whether it's me or David or my family members who live in the Midwest or somebody who lives in a more urban setting, the basic care of what we know for cancer prevention, for example, should be the same for all of us. And sadly, it isn't. So how do we get to that? Next slide. So if you go to the next slide, what we think about is, the typical approach to developing evidence, which pre-implementation science, I think it's fair to say, has been very rigorous. Not to say implementation science isn't, it is very rigorous, but this rigorous method where we control the heck out of everything, and we randomize things, we control them, we do them in the most laboratory sort of based ways so that we are so sure that we're testing just the thing that we're trying to test. Next slide. But we ignore kind of the places in which evidence is used. So we develop evidence in ways that it doesn't translate so well to where evidence is used, which is, in chaotic settings where there are, many demands and many different types of people, many different types of needs. And there's these contexts that are going on around the healthcare that really have to be taken into consideration, the settings in which people live and work and play. So what implementation science does is it tries to really say, let's be rigorous about developing evidence, but developing it in a way that it can be used in the places it needs to be used. Next slide. So if you think about kind of the standard research pipeline, and you can just click through a couple here, David. That's perfect. What often, and kind of a long history of developing interventions, we're asking about, could a program work and does a program work? So you're creating things really in the sort of efficacy and then maybe effectiveness setting. In implementation science, what you're doing is making a program work. Now that we have this evidence-based intervention, and for those who aren't familiar with implementation science, the one thing you're going to find out is we love our jargon. So evidence-based interventions are often made in shorthand to EBIs. So we take these evidence-based interventions and we figure out how to then make them work in different settings, which may mean that you have to do adaptations, you have to prepare the settings, there's all kinds of things that you have to do. So really, implementation science is sort of the later part of the research pipeline, if you will. Next slide. It really matters how you integrate evidence into practice. And there have been a couple of studies that have looked at implementation approach. And when you take that build it and they will come, just let it happen kind of approach, and you say, we've developed this evidence and now the field will figure out how to use it, you find that about 14% of that evidence gets picked up in about 17 years. So it's a very slow boat to trying to get evidence into practice. But when you use implementation science, so for example, when you have an expert implementation team that works in a setting and says, let's figure out how to help you use this evidence, in 3 years, you can get about 80% of that evidence in place. So it really matters to be systematic and planful, deliberate about implementation. Build it and they'll come doesn't work. Nope, that's good. Next slide. So just again, to beat the drum a little bit around, what is implementation research? I teach on this at our School of Public Health, and especially for folks who don't come from a public health tradition, sometimes this can get a little murky. So let's say, for example, we have a research pipeline where we have a new oral preventive medication for some disease X. An epidemiologic study might say, well, what is the association of the drug's mechanism of action with the severity of the disease? That would be a typical kind of epidemiologic question. A clinical efficacy study might say, does the drug reduce the risk of developing that disease? A program effectiveness question might say, what is the effect of a program promoting the use of the drug? And implementation research, we would be asking things like, how can the barriers to the delivery of the drug in primary care be addressed so everybody at risk can have access to it? So that just gives you a little sense about, how you might think about a particular issue across those different points in the research pipeline. Next slide. So there's been a lot of, because we're so in love with jargon in implementation science, there's been a lot of effort to kind of say, help people think through what's an intervention, what's an EBI, what's an implementation strategy. And Jeff Kern, one of our colleagues, really developed this idea of trying to conceptualize what implementation science is. So implementation science, in implementation science, the intervention is known as the thing, not that thing, not the movie thing, but actually the intervention. So the drug, the treatment, the interventional, radiation, radiology, whatever it is, that is the thing, the intervention. In clinical effectiveness research, you're looking at whether that thing, the drug, say in this case, works. In implementation science, you're trying to figure out how to best help people, organizations do the thing, use the drug, make it happen. And in implementation science, we use something called implementation strategies. And that's the stuff we do to help people do the thing. So that might be We would implement facilitation, where we would have experts work with provider teams around how they build the use of a particular intervention into their workflow, how they think about the barriers to adoption, those kinds of things. And then in implementation science, the outcomes are how much we do of that thing. And I'll get to that in a minute. It's how much and how well people do that thing. So to what extent does, in a particular, let's say, a health system, do they use the new drug, and do they use it as intended? Next slide. I just wanted to note that in implementation science, there are, I think, about kind of 4 primary big buckets. We love our theories, models, and frameworks so much. When this field started, and I'm old enough to have been kind of on the beginning phases of the development of this, I remember saying to one of my colleagues, well, the one thing we can do as we're building this field is make sure that we don't develop a million different theories and models and frameworks. Let's just develop a few that we can all use. Unlike in, health behavior and psychology and behavioral science, we have so many, it's just unhelpful. Let's just develop 1 or 2. Well, we now have about 163. So nobody listened to me then. They don't listen to me now when I'm irritated about it. But we have an enormous numbers of theories, models, and frameworks that are useful in different settings to guide our work. We have different kinds of designs we use. We have these implementation strategies, and then we have a different set of outcomes. So if you go to the next slide, I'm just going to quickly walk through a few of these. There's a lot of papers that are available to talk about all these theories, models, and frameworks. And if you're new to the field, it is really useful to start to kind of think about this and understand the theories that we have available. Next slide. And there are some tools to help you kind of think through that. This is one example called the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, or CFIR. And I don't expect you to be able to really see the details on this, but what I wanted to sort of point out here is that in implementation science and in many of our models, what you're thinking about are the characteristics of the intervention, kind of the processes that are going on in that setting. You're thinking about the characteristics of the people involved in the intervention, and that includes in implementation science, the deliverers of that intervention. So the care teams, the people who work in the health center, all of those folks. But really important is the context. So what's happening in that inner setting, inside the delivery system? What is the context like? What's the learning climate like? What's the culture like? And then all the stuff going on the outside. So where is this setting? I do a lot of work in community health centers, and we care a lot about the fact that there are lots of things going on in these outer communities where the staff live and the patients live, and that's impacting what people can bring into their work. So those are really important characteristics. So one of the key things here is understanding things both proximal and more distal as the impact on trying to do the thing. Next slide. There are all these different study designs as well. And one of the things that I loved the most about becoming familiar with implementation science is it removed for me the tyranny of the randomized control trial. And I have to tell this little anecdote. When I went, I started my career at Harvard, but at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. And my boss, this was many years ago, a couple of decades ago, she pulled me aside and she said, this is a clinical setting. It's very, very basic science, a lot of clinical research too, but they live by the randomized control trial. And they think that some of the behavioral stuff we do is kind of loosey-goosey. So do yourself a favor and introduce yourself as a randomized clinical trialist. So for about 20 years, I went around saying, hi, I'm Karen, I'm a randomized clinical trialist. And now I realize I don't have to do that anymore because there's so many more tools that I have at my disposal than just the randomized control trial. And it's very helpful for some questions, but not so much for many things that we're trying to understand in implementation science. So there's a number of papers available to talk about all kinds of different designs that you can use to really try to get at some of these implementation questions. Next slide. And next slide, just go through that. Just there we go. And what this really does is places the idea of context really at the center. So we're in a randomized controlled trial, you're testing an intervention by comparing it with a control condition, and it's highly standardized. You hold everything constant, you randomize people, or clinics or whatever the units are, and they don't really get a choice. Highly trained interventionists, you control the heck out of everything. But there's all this stuff that happens that could impact on those outcomes. And so in implementation science, you're really thinking about context and how you think about kind of the opposite of some of these things here, where in randomized controlled trials, you're basically looking at average outcomes for each group. Well, maybe we don't want to just look at averages. We want to understand the whole process, who benefits, who doesn't benefit. We look at subgroup analyses quite a lot because that's a part to helping us understand the context and so on. So there's a lot of things related to context that you can't really do, or we don't often do as well in RCTs. Next slide. I just wanted to point out another feature of implementation science is that we often think about trying to answer different kinds of questions. So again, our colleague Jeff Curran came up with this concept of hybrid design. So in some implementation studies, you're really trying to figure out the effectiveness of that thing. It's not really established, so you can't go around trying to get everybody to use it because you haven't established that yet. But you do want to understand the context for implementation. So your primary aims are about the effectiveness of the thing, and you have secondary aims to try to understand, once we show this works, how are we going to get it done? So you're moving yourself towards an implementation outcome. In a type 2, you're looking basically both at effectiveness and at implementation outcomes. And then in hybrid 3, you say, we know so much about the effectiveness of this thing. We don't need to study that. What we really need to do is figure out the implementation questions. And so you kind of flip your orientation depending on what really the evidence is and what you're trying to accomplish. I just have 1 or 2 more slides here, I think. And then in implementation science, the outcomes are quite different than they might be in a randomized trial. So really what you're looking at in implementation are implementation outcomes and office service outcomes as well. But in implementation outcomes, we look at things like feasibility. Is this something that you could do at scale in practices across the country? Do people do the thing with fidelity? Or once you put it into the real world, does the whole protocol fall apart and it gets done in a very different way, so you have a different kind of intervention? Penetration, is it used by not just 1 or 2 teams, but by many of the teams? Or what is the uptake across broad numbers of the units of delivery? How acceptable is it? Is it sustainable when the research is over? Is it all going to fall apart? Or have you built something that can last? And that's a big part of implementation science, is not going in and putting a bunch of research staff in so you can now create something that's going to fall apart when you go away. And uptake and cost, those are the key important implementation outcomes. And I think that might be it for me, David.
Yeah, no, that's right. Thanks so much, Molly and Janet. Just curious if at this moment, before we then dive into the observations, if it would be helpful just to see if there's any questions or any thoughts from folks.
Yes, absolutely. So please feel free. You can either raise your hand or put comments or questions in the chat, and I'm happy to facilitate those if members of our audience have just questions or points of clarification at this point before we go into the next piece of the presentation. All right, I'm not seeing any. So David, you can go ahead and continue.
Okay, yeah, no, thanks. And feel free again, as things strike you, no hesitation. I've got chat open. I can see participants. I'm trying to navigate these things myself as well. So where are we? So Karen did a wonderful job in very tight time frame of just talking about some of the amazing progress that many of you, recognizing again names and and others have really helped us get to. So it has felt as if implementation science is moving more toward maturity in terms of our thoughtfulness about concepts, in terms of the empirical base upon which we can then say what are the next set of questions, even in terms of the range of different questions that we're asking. And so, we did think around this time last year that it might be a helpful thing just to, check ourselves a bit and say, well, if we take a step back and we try and think about what we want this field to be, what are some of the observations we have about things that we've done well, but in some cases, things that maybe we have given short shrift to, or that have unhelpfully landed us in these different tensions within academic communities or between research and practice and policy communities. And so this idea of navigating the field toward maturity was, again, in trying to shed a light on what we saw as certain challenges and potentially some opportunities. And so what we want to do for the remainder is really walk through walk through these observations. I do see that Betsy put into the chat this notion of what role does change theory play in implementation science, and I think underlining the 163 or whatever the current number is of our theories, models, and frameworks are actually a lot of behavior change theories. In some cases, they're directly targeting individuals. In other cases, from my own background, it's really looking at how do we support change within organizations. There are theories, models, and frameworks that are really focusing on policy level change, community level change. So I think change theory plays an immense role in implementation science. And I think part of it is this question of, at what level or multiple levels are we really seeing implementation activity that's either needed, that's ongoing, and how best do we understand it. Karen, anything just quickly that you wanted to chime in on that?
Yeah, I think you hit that exactly right. I mean, I think in implementation science, often people forget about the fact that you are asking people to make changes. So you're going into a health system and you want them to do this thing. I mean, I've learned so much over the years about, the concept of workflow from nursing, from quality improvement. I mean, these things have been known for a long time. And I think implementation sciences have initially come in, and I'll count myself in these people, and not sort of recognizing that there's a lot of change tools that need to be considered as we go forward. So I think we as a field have learned a lot from our colleagues in other areas about that aspect. So it really is integrated quite deeply.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so as we just reflected quickly on how much we've seen growth in interest, in opportunities, in centers and infrastructures, that we still need to very strongly consider this balance between this notion of legitimacy within a larger biomedical research enterprise. Again, as Karen said, advice that she was given around how do I define myself to different audiences, we still have that desire for folks who are not as well familiar of being able to explain the scientific rigor that underscores the questions that we're asking and how we best answer it. And then at the same time, our North Star should always be ensuring that the questions, the studies are as relevant or as responsive to what's happening at every level of our systems where we're ultimately trying to benefit people's lives, people's health, people's healthcare at those different levels. And so that just gave us this sense of we shouldn't assume that we've moved beyond these tensions, but rather we should keep them in mind at all points. And so when we thought about what we aspire to be, we've for a number of years in different initiatives really talked about embracing this notion of a big tent, this idea that implementation science should assume that there's so much expertise, there's so much experience, there's a necessity of having partners all contributing, not just to, on the front end of what are some of the challenges that we're struggling with, but through to thinking about what are the right questions to ask, what are the right strategies to try the development and the execution of any of the studies that we're doing. And so just trying to embrace this big tent made us then think through what are some of the observations that we have, either about things that are limiting who feels comfortable being under this tent, or that enable us to make sure that we're squarely focused on what matters. Okay. And so, we thought about, the sort of developmental life cycle of implementation science. And maybe we're somewhere in adolescence, maybe we're in young adulthood. I have 2 teenagers, and on any day, they seem incredibly old and incredibly young, and maybe that's where we are as a field. And so just setting that up, if we're struggling through that adolescence or young adulthood, what are some of the assumptions that we have and some observations to lead toward a bigger tent. So here you see this bigger tent. So the first observation that we started with was this idea that implementation science is really about the questions that we're answering, the questions that we're trying to answer. It's about the ways in which we're seeking to frame those questions, and then the ways in which we're choosing different methods among a wide variety, as Karen had mentioned, that are rigorous, that are valid to all those to whom it matters, methods and measures, and that we should not focus so much on individual identities or terms. As Karen had said, we have a lot of jargon in the field, and we should never have that limit who can participate. And so as we thought about that first observation, this thing about can we anchor more on the questions and less on identities, we notice that it seems for some like there's almost an in group and an out group where implementation science is concerned. There have been many folks who will say, and we just had a large meeting with what, 1,500 people or so who came to the DC area just a few weeks ago. And there are people who say, you know, I'm really interested in this area, but I feel like I don't have the card. I'm not a card carrying implementation scientist. And that, I think, is to our peril to not think more about, right? This really ought to be that so many, everyone, it's hard to think about who doesn't have a role to play in helping us frame what matters. And particularly important to recognize that there are all sorts of fields that predated implementation science. Karen mentioned quality improvement, improvement science. I know leaders in improvement science and quality improvement are on this call with us. And it may feel at times like somebody is silenced in the work that they've done, which has really contributed so much to what people are calling as implementation science, but has not necessarily been always given the support and the recognition, because we may isolate by concentrating on terms. So again, with this observation being that we'd like to move beyond terms, we wanted to just pause and see, you know, does this resonate with you? Are there thoughts that you have about how we as a field can move beyond this idea of risking alienation because there's this notion of you need to have a card, and that card says I, David Chambers, and an implementation scientist. So pause point there. Curious what people think.
Hi, this is Jackie Eisler at Michigan State University. I'm a clinical nurse specialist, and I'm also the director for the CNS program. And when you mentioned this has been around before we even had a name for it, and as CNSs, we've been implementing EBPQI process improvements, and with this movement, it does feel like it is starting to alienate, or unless I have a PhD, or unless I am, you know, specifically trained on implementation science, that I'm not good enough anymore.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And that's exactly what we wanted to try and emphasize. That should not be embraced in any way, right? Yeah.
So I'm Carol Howe. I'm from Texas Christian University. Jacqueline, I appreciate your statement. I was a clinical nurse specialist at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia for 25 years. This is all I did in my career at CHOP, was implement EBP innovations, working interdisciplinary, leading teams to implement things. And it's curious, now that I've entered into the implementation science and practice world, I'm finding that there's the NIH, NCATS, all that world, but then there's all the rest of us that are doing lots of implementation. And actually, when I search the literature, trying to find exemplars to do my work, I just get a lot of theoretical papers. Mm-hmm. But what I want are real exemplars of people doing the implementation, because truthfully, it's great that there's like 160 theories, models, and frameworks anymore.
No,
but
it's not.
At the end, it's not. But at the end of the day, I want to implement change. And so I can just pick one model and go from there. I don't need 160. But I would love the world to be a little bit more open to all of us, that really by our training and our job, we were change agents. Mm-hmm. Since the 1980s, by the way. So, yeah.
And I will say, Carol and Jacqueline, I think you guys hit the nail on the head. CNSs have been doing this work for decades. And oftentimes when we talk with CNSs and introduce some implementation science language, they're like, yeah, I've been doing that all along. I didn't call it that. Called it something maybe just a little bit different, but you've been doing this work for decades.
No, so I do love the evidence base of implementation strategies. I do think that's incredibly helpful. And like mapping implementation strategies to barriers or facilitators rather than using my intuition. So I totally appreciate what the science has brought to us, but I would like the world to be a little bit bigger.
Mm-hmm. Great point.
Thank
you.
I
will mention Dr. Sharon Tucker put in the chat, she would say the work in EBP has led to many observations about how to change practice and has led to models of implementation. And again, hospital nurses have been doing this work for decades. And also Betsy Frank had talked about it's really about how to get the thing done, if you will, and show how implementation can actually make something better. And then Janet certainly echoes the comments from the RCNS groups that implementation science is what they do, and they've been doing it for a long time. Anne, I see you had your hand up. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Molly, and David and Karen, thanks. I think that the issues you're raising are really important, but I'd like to thread the needle a little bit differently. I think that there are huge schisms in this emerging field that we call implementation science. I think a huge piece of that is a distinction between the practice of implementation, the actual doing of the work, which is, I think, a lot of what my colleagues have just been talking about, particularly my colleagues who are clinical nurse specialists, who are people who've been working in institutional healthcare settings for many years and doing work that is evidence-based practice, quality improvement, and continue to do that work. The science part of it is the piece that I think we keep kind of pushing out of the frame. And that's where I'd like to bring this back to for just a second and to say, the issue for me is, to what extent are we doing implementation and to what extent are we studying it and learning so that we can build more tools? I really appreciate the comment that was just made about the utility of the strategies that have been developed through the science of implementation, the study and the research on implementation. And I think those are really good exemplars of what we can and have learned. I would argue many of the frameworks are also exemplars. They're catalogs. And I think we have to be careful not to be dismissive of the fact that there are what we would all agree are too many, and that they are not consolidated sufficiently, that people tend to gravitate towards one, stick with it, not necessarily know the literature that has been emerging now for 20 years plus. And your point, David, the fact that these are multiple literatures makes it even more complicated. So I would just say, I think we need to be somewhat careful to distinguish between studying implementation and learning from doing that research and that science, and practicing implementation, doing it in a pragmatic way, but also using tools that have been developed through the science. Mm-hmm. I'll stop there because I'm sure there are a lot of comments about that.
No, well, just to say, Anne, I do really appreciate that, and I think what we were, at least what I think of in the ways that sometimes as a scientific community, folks can err, we can err, is in assuming that there aren't those valuable lessons to draw upon in framing what those questions are, the best ways to answer them. So I think it's a really good point, and in fact, we've been talking a lot about themes for conference and future conferences, and we've talked a lot about in different conferences already about what a shame it is to feel like there is this separation between what if folks who are studying implementation and those who are practicing it every day. And that is really the idea of this big tent, is to try and say that we all can contribute if our primary role is in applying what we know about implementation to sort of individual circumstances. Then that gives us incredible insights as to what are the struggles that we have, what are the broader questions that might resonate, not just for me and my practice, but in for others. So yeah, I mean, and thank you for saying that. It's not in any way to try and diminish the really important work that is being done to study as systematically as possible implementation, but just to try and say, let's not artificially erect a barrier between those who ostensibly are trying to support folks in practice. So great point. Okay, yeah, and I saw Kirsten agrees with Anne directly. Okay, so we had talked just briefly with observation 1 about just trying to say that we wanted to not be held back by specific disciplinary labels, and we've had lots of challenges where, again, somebody who has been doing incredible work for years around quality improvement or improvement science, but doesn't use a similar word as someone else, there creates that gap between a perception that they can contribute and have already contributed to the field. That we wanted to try and make sure that we don't limit ourselves also to just saying the starting point for all that we need to know about implementation comes from selecting an evidence-based practice, but recognizing that there's so much going on in practice around implementation, around how different things are adopted, how they're implemented, how they're sustained, that could add to our knowledge base beyond this idea of I as a researcher or I within my, with my team, choose that one off-the-shelf manualized intervention. And that is the sole place where I derive all that I know about adoption, implementation, and sustainment. And then just recognizing with the incredible advances in designs and really balancing rigor and relevance as much as possible, feasibility of what can be done, and making sure that we don't create these studies that are elegant and take 25 years to do, because that's not going to get us anywhere closer to the ultimate aim of using what we know, right? And so it was that idea of how do we make sure that the information is timely for practice and policy, and it's, I think, getting out of our silos a bit. Okay, so let's see, I'm trying, okay, yeah. So we got to observation 2, and it's a related thing and to something that we've said before, but just really trying to do justice to the incredible literatures, the incredible expertise and experience that we have already drawn upon as a foundation for what folks who are who are thinking about implementation science are doing, are advancing, are conceptualizing, and making sure that we value and leverage those underlying contributions as much as possible. And so we know fundamentally that most of our implementation science efforts have been multidisciplinary, they've been team-based. But there have been legitimate concerns as to whether implementation science seems to be reinventing things that we already know, or saying we've learned this and nobody else knew this before we started to talk about it ourselves. That there at times there have been some incentives to try and say, to legitimize implementation science within a research community, we need to show that we're unique, we need to justify the work we're doing. No, we're not building off of other folks, and that's not helpful. So really just wanted to again pause here with this second observation. Does this resonate? Do you feel like there are things that we can do to better appreciate, to better embrace the incredible work that is not defined necessarily under an implementation science heading that has contributed and allowed us to get to where we are? So any thoughts there?
I have a thought. Whoops, there we go. This is Sharon Tucker. I'm actually the president of MNRS too. So thank you all for your willingness to join us today and enlighten us. My comment was related to, and I know that you all have done work in the de-implementation space too. And when I think about the busy clinicians, and I speak from hospital settings primarily, but when I think about, and having served in hospital settings for many years, the flavor of the month sort of expectation that staff would come at, that we would constantly be expecting them to change based on regulations, payer, accreditation, and the burnout that happens because of that, and their willingness to just want to continue to change when they need some stability in practice. I think that's really important as we move forward, is that we are making sure that is the best evidence, and then indeed it will replace something else, so that it's just not an add-on, because I think that's where people really burn out in busy clinical settings today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, appreciate that. And I see Betsy's point just about thinking what is potentially unique or what is reimagined as being important. I mean, there's, again, from that initial observation, if we keep laser focus on what are the key questions that we need to answer and how best to answer them, and hopefully that diminishes the maybe over-reliance on a particular term or the uniqueness. But I think to Anne's point, I think there is that challenge when there may be value in trying to adopt identities. There may be value, certainly there is value in finding common purpose with others who do have sort of similar perspectives and thoughts in mind. It looks like Kath has a.
Hi, so happy to be on this call. I am very interested in a response to an item that I sent in earlier, but I also want to say that there's nothing that energizes the front line like seeing improvements in safety metrics. And so the faster we can get to looking at the impact of implementation of evidence-based practices and best practices and the efficiency of those implementation strategies themselves, the faster we can look at the impact on patient and population outcome, I think the more excited frontline folks that carry the big burden will become, and the less change fatigue. It will lessen the change fatigue.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's really absolutely helpful, and I think we've talked certainly about trying to make sure that we can quantify as best as possible the impact that we're making, an impact on things that certainly matter to individuals and to systems. That's a great point. Yeah, sorry, I was just digesting the chat as well.
Yeah, and Elise made a comment to, one of the things she struggles with is, what do we know, but it hasn't been documented? And is it actually evidence-based if it hasn't adequately been studied or documented? Especially within kind of an across disciplines too.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And Larry Green, who participated in a lot of our early trainings, talked about the underappreciation and under capture, I guess, of practice-based evidence and trying to make sure that we're learning from everything that we are doing. Yeah, that's a really great point. The third observation that we had was that, Karen and I and others have been involved in a number of different efforts to train folks, to build capacity. And we recognize certainly that large tent is what needs the support and what needs the capacity, not necessarily just individual folks underneath. And so, we reflected on how we have created a lot of opportunities, and some folks may have taken advantage of these who are tuned in to get a deep introduction into those 4 big buckets that Karen mentioned and other things, and get guidance around, I'm a researcher, I have a study in mind, and so I want some feedback on my concept. That there's certainly been success out of these training programs in those researchers getting grants, publishing papers, getting different positions in career. But I think we recognize that we haven't done as much to really think through, everyone under the tent and the support and the capacity that is needed. There are some great examples. The Center for Implementation in Canada is one, and certainly others will know of them that have really turned their attention to supporting implementation practice as much as possible. But I think we haven't really taken either as much of a holistic approach to who needs what, who's involved in our implementation science ecosystem, and at what levels are we making sure that we're providing guidance, again, more on the introduction to the field than in supporting people along a longer trajectory. So really curious as to any thoughts about this.
And Kath, I see your notes now. They hadn't appeared in the chat previously on our end, so I can go ahead and we can kind of go through them as well at this point. But Anne, go ahead and unmute and ask your question while I'm looking at these.
Sure, and I apologize. I actually am having some major connection problems at home, so I've been kind of in and out. But I think your question is a really important one, David. And it's way too easy to default to how do we fund this kind of ongoing supportive training? As you know, and since I've worked with both you and Karen in training efforts, which are the kind that I think you're talking about, that sort of first bolus, let's give people an introduction to the field, let's help people understand aspects of the field. I think there's been some support for that, but not a great deal. And then when we talk about how do we engage at a further level, it probably does come to the issue of, curricular programming, planning for how to sustain the education. This is a deeper field than many people understand when they begin to enter it. And getting to depth is hard. And I would just say that, I think we probably need more degree programs, but we are soon, if not already, at a point where I think we also need to be thinking about standards, competencies, and accreditations. And right now, we don't have any of those sorts of infrastructural pieces in the field. So I'll stop there.
Well, it sounds like a beautiful segue, actually, to what I see that Kath had put in the chat.
Yeah.
And certainly, our some of our colleagues, Ross Brownson comes to mind, and others have published papers around what have been seen as competencies at sort of beginner and intermediate and advanced levels. Others have done the same, and so that might help us. But again, that also had more of a focus on the researcher and their stage than the many other partners. So yeah, I think it sounds like you and Kath are in direct agreement, certainly with my perspective of the more that we can think about what are the metrics really of making progress in the field, and what would people best want and need to know. Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you both. So also conscious of time, folks may have a hard out at the top of the hour. So just going through quickly the last couple of observations, we really do see that at the heart of anything that we want to do, this notion of an implementation science ecosystem relies on benefits from partnerships between and among our researchers from multiple disciplines, but importantly, partnerships within community and clinical settings that are essential to making sure, and I sort of alluded to this before, there's so many practice-based research networks that have really been contributing. There are many opportunities to think about sort of natural areas, natural labs, or natural places where we can learn from ongoing implementation practice, where we have a chance to think more about the longer life cycle of implementation, de-implementation, adaptation, sustainment, et cetera. And so ideally wanting to make sure that we have a safe space to be able to continue to learn as contexts continue to change, as the interventions continue to change, and that we try and build and support those partnerships however we can. And then the final point, and then I think this gives us a chance to go to whatever final sort of thoughts, discussions for the last few minutes, is that we don't want to lose sight that many of us entered this space because we saw inadequacies in the care or the supports that our family members, that ourselves, that our loved ones, and those who we work with are getting out of health and out of healthcare. And that there was this desire, because there's lots that we know, to make sure that what we know is what we do, but that relies on our patients, our practitioners, our policymakers, our administrators being at the center of the investigations that we're doing. And so really trying to think about what are ways to optimize the partnership, the inclusion, the leadership of many of our partners in being able to help to drive the evidence, being able to discern what is meaningful, what are the key gaps, what do we need to know, and then how can we make sure that we overcome those gaps. So we did, as a sort of final tool within this commentary, just tried to think about the sort of who, what, where, why, when, and how of where we feel like we currently are as a field, where we want to ideally go, and some strategies for how to get there. But would really love to just see if you have any additional thoughts that help us to reestablish implementation science as this big tent, and make sure that we're doing justice to and relying on so much that folks are offering and have already given us. With that, I'm going to stop sharing so we can all see, and I see their hands up.
Sure, Anne, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just say very briefly, my strongest suggestion would be, let's stop using the term implementation science to mean everything, and talk about science and practice of implementation, both of which are fully valued and fully supported. I think if we can do that, if we can make that shift, we will have a much bigger tent.
Mm-hmm. Nice, thank you.
This is Jackie again. And I really like what you said. That was beautiful. I also think that we still have a challenge implementing evidence-based practice at the bedside. And I think this is where this fits in so perfectly, where we strengthen that, because yes, we can make a change happen, but is it sustainable? Is there a return on investment? Are we really implementing what needs to be done, or are we just doing whatever our administrative directors are telling us we need to do it, and we need to do it this way? So I think it would be important to have that additional, if it is a competency, or if it's whatever it is, but it needs to marry the EBP and quality improvement that we already have you know, our DNP students doing, what we have our research students in doing, so that we can have it coming from all angles. So it's not like in a separate entity, but it is ingrained, it is woven throughout, and it's strong.
Awesome.
If I can just jump on, that's so true. And Jacqueline, I think you got really close to where my heart is with this is, and what's been expressed is implementation science, the tag of what we've been doing as the largest healthcare provider and the most trusted nursing on the front lines. It's been there all along. And I think embracing okay, so the observation that I've made is that we have done a great job, NCI and David and that group and Russ, you guys growing this has just been phenomenal. At the same time, we acted as though it was a whole brand new thing. And nurse administrators have been, and managers have been managing change all this time. Clinical nurse specialists have been managing change all this time. The whole world of organizational development has done change management. And so I think one of the big tent things I would like to see is to say, let's poke some holes in that tent and look outward and bring those theories in. I mean, there's 300 theories, models, and frameworks in implementation dissemination. But I looked up, there are literally thousands of theories in psychology. So poking those holes open and saying, oh, wait, there's a lot from marketing that we can put into dissemination activities. There's a lot from change management and organizational development. So while we've grown it, I feel like inside out, it's time to really embrace the outside in, and the interprofessional aspects, I guess, need to be a bigger group than the interprofessional definitions that we have now, and also to be comfortable with these are overlapping, hybrid, quality improvement, change, dissemination, implementation of those things it's what makes the ragu sauce. It's all in there. So that would be my observation for saying how to get the tent bigger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, thanks so much for that. I mean, certainly when I started studying this, there was no term implementation science. It was under a much broader heading of, it was translating research into practice, everyone. So there was just this kind of murkiness of saying, we know that we struggle with this broader connection between these studies, these more, sort of clean studies, and the challenges of what we do on a daily basis. But I think a great point to say outside. I like the from out, outward in. That's a beautiful image for me.
All right, any kind of final concluding thoughts or comments from the group?
I guess my final thought goes back to the questions that we can't answer today, but what's the best path forward to stabilize the field? Because I think that, the whole idea that attracted me to spend this time with you today was the maturity in the field. And is it time for a standardized national curriculum? What would that look like? There's scores of competencies and even more training programs out there. So how do we level that? And I think that's our challenge, to come up with strategies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's now 11. No, I think it's more than that. I'm trying to remember how many years ago it was when several of us had organized just a smaller discussion about the then, relatively newer training programs that were going on. But, more than a decade has passed since then, and there's so much more out there. But I think it's a good point of trying to say, to what degree are we able to standardize more and think about the value of different things, but also, value for whom, as opposed to saying what we're standardizing gives us a core curriculum, but only for a subset of the people who we imagine being under this large tent. But Kath, a great thought.
All right, well, it is the top of the hour and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you again to our speakers for their expertise today and sharing this important conversation with all of us. We look forward to continued work in this area and lots of opportunity for collaboration going forward. All right, thanks everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks.
Bye.